me to stop that. All right. Well, welcome everybody to our February meeting of the Alpha Bird Nature Club. Every winter now, the last few years, we've been saving the January and February meetings to Zoom only, just because some of us that are not real young don't really appreciate driving around in the dark and the snow and ice. And as it turns out, I would be fretting all day when the storm tonight's going to be starting. So, it really it takes a lot of the anxiety out of hosting the meeting. I do have to say, a couple of years ago, I thought we were all set for the March meeting when we had a snow squall that started at 6 o'clock. You know what I mean? And that really kind of blew my mind about that. So hopefully everybody's in a safe place and won't be driving around at night. So a couple of quick announcements. We have lots of programmings coming up, and if you're not a member of the Alpha Bird Nature Club, send me an email. We can put you on the membership list and get you the ability to kind of see what all the different programming we have moving forward. And there's lots of cool stuff happening. We did just announce a new program yesterday that's actually a scholarship program to allow people to go to some advanced camps or classes, things like Eagle Hill or other places. We'll be able to do a couple of these events, a year. So we're really kind of excited about that. I know there's people that are trying to expand their knowledge base, and this is appropriate for basically students from 12 and older, and even some of us that are lifelong learners could actually perhaps qualify for the scholarship. So it's a new program. We're funded for the first year from donations that were made in Bob Coyle's name, and we're going to see where it leads us. But we're excited to try to invest in people, and that to me is what's going to save us, is if we have enough people coming along that have a good respect for natural history and what's going on. It's going to be an important thing for the future. And the other announcement is just that we did do a cultural council grant, which got 6 pair of binoculars and some field guides to a after school science club being formed at the local middle school. So we're very happy to support Elizabeth Castaneri, the teacher, and getting that program on board. So again, we're doing a real focus to try to, reinvigorate our attention to the younger people, and some of us, I say younger people of all ages, so, but anyway, so that's the latest focus on that. And we appreciate everybody's support. So without further ado, I'd like to just acknowledge my friend Eric Eaton. I got to know Eric when he was out here at UMass, and we spent many a weekend together romping around looking for bugs. And it was really one of my favorite summers, I think. And I've been able to be out in New Mexico with Eric and his wife Heidi, and been around different places. So it's really been a long relationship between us, even though Eric's out in Kansas at this time. So it's a long distance relationship. So we're really pleased to have Eric here, and we're going to be discussing, our inclusion with birding and how we're going to be better at it, and see if we can't be better human beings in this day of where people aren't being the best human beings. So I'll take it away, Eric.
Oh, thank you, David, for that kind introduction. Yeah, likewise. That my time spent with you has been a joy, and I thank you for taking me to some of these places that most people don't get to go to, like the Quab and what have you. So so thank you. Yeah. Usually I'm invited to talk to groups like this about insects because that's what I know. And so I'm definitely out of my comfort zone here. I'm winging it a little bit, pun fully intended. But I will say that I gave a version of this presentation to the Aiken Audubon Society in Colorado when we lived there in Colorado Springs, and it was very well received. So I'm optimistic that what I have to say still, holds favor with most folks. Um, by the way, this is an actual sign from the March for Science. I think that was in 2017 after the 2016 election. You know, there is, this obviously has not been a photo manipulated in any way. Like, nobody totally erased what was actually on the sign and put my program title onto it. LOL, wink, wink. Uh, what what I'd like to explore tonight is two things. Number one, who are we as birders? What would we like birding to look at like, in a utopian sense, maybe? And the second half is going to explore ways that we can become better advocates for ourselves as birders and also for birds themselves. Because obviously, if we don't have birds, we can't be birding, right? So, some of the traditional arguments in favor of bird conservation, I believe, are kind of weak, and I'll talk about why I believe that's true, and then maybe point us towards better ways of advocating. Now, I do not pretend to have all the answers to this, and maybe not even most of them, but my goal here is to get us thinking a little bit differently and get you thinking as an individual creatively and putting your own ideas out there. I want to give you permission to think outside the box. Sometimes that's difficult to do because of social pressure and what have you. Now, let's see if I can advance these slides. Oh, I can. Oh, fantastic. When he was president of the American Birding Association, at one point, Jeff Gordon asked, quote, "Is being a birder an identity that you wear proudly? If not, why not?" And I think an equally good question is, well, what is a birder? What does a birder look like? What kind of image are we projecting as birders? Now, this is a pretty typical, perhaps stereotypical image of a group of birders. And when we see an image like this, especially if we're not birders, what's the vibe we're getting here? Well, number one is this kind of monotone. Birding is a very white privileged activity. And I don't say that to shame you. I just think that we're usually not very cognizant of that because we're kind of in an echo chamber, if you will, in that most of the people we associate with birding look like us. But so what does the white privilege? Actually, I have a friend who does not like the term white privilege and prefers the term white advantage, which I think is maybe even a better term. So what does that mean? Well, it means, for example, if you're in a public space with your binoculars, you're less likely to get hassled or harassed than someone of a different color. If you're driving down a rural road very slowly looking at birds, you're not as likely to be pulled over by the cops or met at the end of a driveway with a shotgun. We don't arouse suspicion typically, but other people who don't look like us do, especially in today's climate. So there's a safety issue around birding. Not everybody feels comfortable being a birder. There's also the fact that we usually have a luxury of time. Uh, we're not working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, so we have time to go birding. We also probably are more affluent than other demographics. So we can afford the binoculars and other optics, spotting scopes and what have you, and nice cameras. Maybe we can even afford to go birding overseas. Maybe, maybe we have that capability as well. So we do have a lot of advantages in our whiteness. Many birders are older. Hey, look, I just turned 64 last month, so I'm part of this demographic myself, right? And I think that's, again, kind of a stereotypical assessment of birders. I know plenty of younger birders, but this is kind of the picture people, the general public, has of birders. The birders who are front and center are often male. They're men. Um, that's starting to change, thankfully. We're starting to see women in leadership roles in birding. And I hope that trend continues. But for the time being, it's not, it's a minority of women who are front and center for birding. Now, obviously, you can't tell a person's sexual inclination, right, from any kind of image. But again, I think we tend to assume a lot just, well, in our day-to-day lives, period, but also in the birding community. We definitely look at a picture like this and look, okay, everyone's upright and they probably walked a fair distance to get to this spot to look at birds. That's not necessarily true for people, of all people who want to bird. Are we making accommodations for people who are disabled or are neurodivergent? And what does that look like? Well, we'll talk about that here in a minute. There are definitely people of color who are birders, and they even have Black Birders Week. This year, Black Birders Week is May 25th to the 31st of 2025. There are Black Birder clubs, like Black Birders of Louisiana, pictured here. So there are definitely birders who are not white. But what I'm driving at with this is that it's more of a separate but equal kind of thing. What kind of efforts are we making to integrate? And why is that important? Well, of course, we want people to look at birds, no matter if they're doing it independently or not. But what else are we not learning by excluding people of color? We're not learning about their culture. We watch the halftime show of the Super Bowl. We don't know what's going on because we haven't been interacting with people of color. So there's a lot to be derived for us as white birders by being inclusive of Black birders, for example. Thankfully, there are a lot of initiatives to get young people involved in birding. And so we have things like the Michigan Young Birders Camp. I know there are young birder camps also in Arizona and Colorado, because I know some of the people who work at those camps. And there are young birders clubs. So that we're doing a pretty good job right now of bringing more young people into the fold. And again, the next thing to do is to help promote them into positions of leadership, because they're going to be the ones that are better able, through their command of the digital age, to be able to recruit even more young people into birding. Women have their own bird clubs, and this is very helpful because it creates a safe space, especially if they're inclusive of trans female individuals. Creates a safe space free of sexual harassment, free of assumptions made about their level of knowledge. It's just a much safer place for women birders. There are even tour guides that do exclusively female tours. I think of Tiffany Kirsten down in the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas as being the premier example of that. And there are groups of birders in the LGBTQ community as well who have their own events, like Let's Go Birding Together. They're starting to be embraced again, finally, by some of these larger organizations. But we want them to have a safe space where they can feel free to express their identity. Now, this is, I think this is somewhat unfortunate that our stereotypical image of disabled birders or nature recreationists, period, is one of people in wheelchairs. Certainly, there are people with mobility issues, but there are a lot of people with hidden disabilities, and they're not always inclined to make that known. And so it's incumbent upon us as able-bodied people to not assume that everyone who may look fully able is so, and provide accommodations ahead of time for them. And birdability.org, I feel like it came into existence a millisecond ago, but it's an organization that helps us understand what accommodations are needed for the disabled and helps foster a better relationship with them. This is Virginia Rose, who was the founder of Birdability, and they have their own week, Birdability Week. And this year is from October 20th to 27th, 2025. There are other helpful organizations too. Access Birding is a consulting firm consisting of one individual who works mostly with parks and reserves, helping them become better at accommodating disabled birders and, again, nature recreationists in general. I had a hard time finding graphics that properly communicate, what neurodiversity is and what a neurodivergent person looks like. And that's kind of the point. You can't tell by looking at someone if they have a different way of relating to the world than we do. And apparently a rainbow infinity symbol is the symbol for neurodiversity. But so what does that mean? What does neurodiversity mean? Well, it encompasses a great deal of different, I hesitate to even use the word conditions, but again, it's different ways of perceiving and interacting with the world, basically. The important thing to remember is that it doesn't mean an inferior way of experiencing the world or learning, or it's not it's not a disability as much as just a difference. And we've been very assumptive in believing that most people view and interact with the world the way we do. So, for example, neurodiversity would include the autism spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia, Down syndrome, Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. So there's a lot of things that fall under that umbrella of neurodivergence. And what does that mean as far as how we relate to people like that? Well, it just means there's differences in learning, thinking, and behaving and interacting with other people and with their environment. Often they have a sensitivity to sound, textures, and other stimuli. It's very easy for them to become overwhelmed in crowds with too much stimulation, loud noises, that kind of thing. What's helpful in outings for people who are neurodivergent, and again, I claim to know next to nothing about this, but I also don't see anybody talking about this with any regularity, is to make sure ahead of time they know when your outing is, how to get there, exactly what's going to happen during that outing, when exactly it's ending. So there's that expectation of when your outing is ending, and the freedom to leave that outing at any point in time if they become uncomfortable with it. So there's a lot of very basic things we can do to accommodate people, again, who perceive and interact with our natural world in a different manner, and with other human beings. I think it's also important to mention indigenous ways of knowing. It's helpful to remember that we must present ourselves as settlers, that the land we are on at any given moment, anywhere, is indigenous land. That doesn't necessarily mean we are less than, but it recognizes that we indeed came here from elsewhere, and we need to represent as such. Now, indigenous knowledge is very different from scientific knowledge in the sense that indigenous traditions are very much oral instead of written. And so it's passed down from generation to generation orally rather than in the written word. They have a different relationship to other species, not in a scientific way, but in terms of seeing other species as relations. And that may mean mythologically speaking, or it may mean ancestrally speaking. There's a different kind of reverence indigenous peoples have towards other species and to the habitats that those species inhabit. And by the nature of tribes and bands, a band is a subset of a tribe, by the way. I just learned that today. Their knowledge is very localized. And so it's very difficult to generalize about indigenous peoples as a whole. So I would encourage all groups like your club to invite indigenous peoples to speak to that and learn firsthand from them what kind of knowledge they bring and how they relate to the landscape. So in summary, I had to use the Drake meme. I'm sorry. I know everybody does this, but basically white, cis, straight, neurotypical birding. Oh, that's so yesterday. All right. But inclusive birding. Yeah, that's more like it. That's hip. But it's more than that, of course. It's recognizing that other people different from us bring strengths that we don't have. And so before I dive into the next, oh wait, hang on. I also want to mention gatekeeping. And that's a different kind of thing where we're accidentally exclusive of other people, especially newbies to birding. So for example, bird banding codes. Personally, I hate acronyms to begin with. There's too many of them. I have to look them up all the time to know what the person means. If we can make birding easier, let's do that. Now, if you're at a bird banding station, yes, that's definitely a place where you want to introduce the idea of bird banding codes. If you're out in the field on a field trip that's not involving bird banding, maybe ease into that down the line, and please address the common loon as the common loon, and the osprey is the osprey, and the Blackburnian warbler as that rather than BLBW, until people get caught up to a level where they feel confident using that kind of thing. So our vocabulary can be very exclusionary if we're not careful. There's another kind of gatekeeping that is literal gatekeeping, and that's in the financial sense, that there are often fees associated with access to areas like state parks, national parks, sometimes wildlife preserves or refuges. This is outside the ability of a lot of people to pay to get in there. So what do you do? Well, if you're able, maybe pay for people that could otherwise not afford it so that they can have access to the same things that you enjoy. Same thing applies to optics. And I love, Dave, that you gave that example where you're donating optics from people that have upgraded to something better and giving other people a chance by lending, by lending those binoculars and spotting scopes and what have you. That's a fantastic thing. And there are other places that are doing that. The Audubon of Kansas, where I live, they have backpacks that they make and that they put out into libraries to let kids check them out and then go out in the field with them. So those kinds of initiatives are very helpful. Same thing goes with cameras. You're probably not going to lend out your camera. More power to you if you do, but just recognizing the fact that, okay, this is an advantage you have that someone with less affluence doesn't, maybe humbles us a bit and makes us a little more sensitive to those other folks. Now, if anyone has any questions up until this point, I'll happily entertain them now before I dive into the advocacy for birding conservation. Otherwise, we can continue.
Yeah, I don't see any hands or the chat mentioned, so we can probably move on and we could open it up at the end for a little more discussion.
Okay. Well, these are illustrations of the Carolina parakeet, and I don't know if I can ever bring myself to forgive my ancestors for rendering this species extinct. I live in northeast Kansas now along the banks of the Missouri River, and we actually had flocks of this species down along the river in, pecan groves and what have you, if you can believe that pecans get up this far. But of course, I can't see them now. We that's just not a possibility. Same with the passenger pigeon, which used to be the most abundant, maybe the most abundant vertebrate in North America until we, rendered them extinct. We obviously don't want these kinds of extinction events to happen, but it's not trending well. um, and this is just since 1970, and this is graphic, I'm sure, is one you've seen elsewhere. Um, we're eliminating birds in any number of ways, mostly through habitat destruction. But of course, there's a lot of other impacts that we're having on birds through our pets and through artificial lighting at night. Where we place wind farms, these kinds of things. So let's look at some of the strategies that we have currently for advocating for bird conservation and indeed conservation, period. Personally, I think some of these are weak, and I'll explain why. One is we argue for the conservation of wildlife to benefit future generations. Another argument you hear a lot is that we claim to speak for other species. We argue for the rights of nature, and we tend to react to individual events. Well, of course, we want to protect birds for future generations, especially if we have kids or grandkids, maybe. We certainly want a world for them, that the same kind of world that we have enjoyed growing up, and even better if at all possible. Well, that's fine. So what's wrong with that? When you're trying to persuade lawmakers and developers of this, they hear, oh, future generations, okay, that's something we can entertain a little bit down the road. There's no urgency. And if there's anything about our current situation, it's that it's urgent. So we don't want to give doorways for procrastination. This also assumes that future generations will have less of an impact on the environment that we do. I think that's something we should question a little bit as well. And lastly, I think it ignores our debt to prior generations, right? So, we owe as much, I think, to the likes of Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, Roger Tory Peterson, Florence Miriam Bailey, as we do to future generations. These giants in the environmental movement got us to where we are. We owe it to them not to backslide, and indeed to build upon that legacy that they left us. Another argument we get is that, or we have that we use a lot, is that, oh, we're speaking for other species. Okay, we're We're the voice for the voiceless. Well, forgive me, but that sounds a little cuckoo to the average person. Okay, or like we're some kind of Dr. Doolittle that's able to talk to the animals and then just translate it for the rest of the world to understand. Now, certainly science has illuminated the lives and biological requirements of our avian friends and other forms of wildlife as well, but that's not the same as claiming that we're speaking for other species. Another uh, argument that some optimistically make is that we're arguing for the rights of nature. And this is not to say that it hasn't been successful, but you know, we're slow to recognize the rights of some human demographic categories. We're seeing this in spades right now. And success in rights of nature movements requires the leadership and initiation by indigenous peoples. That's the only way this has ever succeeded. And there have been success stories. For example, Article 14 of the Ecuador Constitution states, quote, the right of the population to live in a healthy and ecologically balanced environment that guarantees sustainability is recognized, unquote. And that passed in 2008. It has not gone unchallenged. And this is the other thing. A lot of things, even put into a constitution, are not necessarily permanent. So we have to constantly fight for the persistence of rights of nature arguments. New Zealand has been ahead of the game in a lot of ways, including rights of nature. And again, this was driven by the Maori tribe, this particular grant of a New Zealand river to the same legal rights as human beings. So, and again, this is a very geographically isolated situation in this case too. So it's not necessarily a widespread blanket kind of recognition. And lastly, we tend to react to individual events. Now, I grew up in Oregon, and so when the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was seized by armed ranchers, I think this was in 2016, excuse me. Um, if you're not familiar with where the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is, it's in a remote corner of Southeast Oregon, about as far away from Portland and other populated cities in Oregon as you could possibly get. And so even having a protest of this magnitude, as depicted here, was a real challenge. And it was successfully ended in favor of our public lands. But what I'm getting to here, or getting at here, is that how did it come to this? Why do we not have a movement that prevents this kind of thing from happening in the first place? And that's something that we could ask right now of our country as a whole. How do we not have protections in place that do protect our rights as birders? So what would be some stronger strategies then for bird conservation and advocating for ourselves as well? Well, number one, I would say assert your personal rights to nature. Be proactive in your civic engagement. Cultivate public appreciation for nature in places where it's not a common occurrence. Forge alliances with indigenous groups. Again, I invite you and other organizations to invite representatives of those groups to speak to you, and to be proud of your birder identity, as Jeff Gordon asked in our very first slide there. The late Michael Soule, in an interview, said, quote, species have an intrinsic value. They're valuable simply because they exist. They don't need our stamp of approval. Biodiversity doesn't have to be of use. I think that's a really important point. We often use that as well in arguing for conservation. He goes on to say, almost everything important in our lives comes back to love, to what feels good, to the people and places we like to be around, and the activities that stimulate us, unquote. Um, and indeed, I mean, our Declaration of Independence states, this quote that we all know: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you're like me, you count birds and the natural world as part of your happiness. You have a right to that. Aldo Leopold said in his landmark book, A Sand County Almanac, quote, for us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, or probably the internet, to update that. And the chance to find a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. Well said. Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, quote, to the birdwatcher, the suburbanite who derives joy from birds in his garden, the hunter, the fisherman, or the explorer of wild regions, anything that destroys the wildlife of an area for even a single year has deprived him of pleasure to which he has a legitimate right. Justice William O. Douglas and Helene B. Hart authored a Wilderness Bill of Rights in 1966, in which they asserted, quote, we believe in the right of children to an understanding of their place in nature's community, of which they are a part. We believe in their right of discovery and adventure in nature's world. Well, this applies to children of all ages, including the ones in existence right now. So remember that future generations start out as present generations. Being an entomologist and an enthusiast of wasps, I love this quote. The late Howard Evans, in his book, Life on a Little Known Planet, from 1966, says, quote, I happen to like yellow jackets. Do I not have a right to yellow jackets if my neighbor has a right to a cat? But you can co-opt this quote if you want and turn it into something like, I happen to like wild birds. Do I not have a right to enjoy wild birds if my neighbor has a right to a cat? And of course, this works on several levels, given what we know about predation of birds by feral and outdoor domestic felines. Nigel Collar is a biologist in the United Kingdom who's a well-known figure in wildlife conservation there. Less so over here, surprisingly. He said in American Birds in 1988, quote, if the quality of our lives is to be ransacked no further, then we must be ready to stand up for the earth and for ourselves, italics his. Again, that emphasis on standing up for your rights to bird is extremely important and the strongest argument you can make. He goes on to say elsewhere in 2003, quote, honesty, after all, brings its own authenticity. The universal loathing of corruption, which is socially divisive and a predictable upshot of the tragedy of the commons, is evidence of the respect in which people throughout the world hold truth, the one great undebasable currency. Being honest at least gives the conservation advocate a real chance of earning such respect and thereby of building a bond of real trust between people. And of course, now we're having to start almost from scratch in terms of how we define truth even. But I still believe that this is one of the most powerful arguments I've seen made. Michael Soule once again, quote, when I'm in a place with many creatures, I feel good. And when there are no creatures around, I feel bad. It's not rational. It's a personal aesthetic. You just want to be around the things you love because they make you feel happy. And I think that probably sums up, I know that sums up my emotions around this and hopefully yours as well. Robert Michael Pyle is a literary mentor of mine, and an excellent nature writer. If you haven't looked into some of his books, I highly recommend them. He wrote, quote, "Brown pelicans fish by slamming directly into the sea, great bills agape, making sure of solid contact with the resource they seek. Black skimmers, graceful tern-like birds with longer lower mandibles than upper, fly over the surface with just the lower halves of their bills in the water. They catch fish too, but avoid bodily immersion by merely skimming the surface." And this quote sets the stage for his comparison to those of us who are nature aficionados. He says, quote, "In my view, most people who consider themselves nature lovers behave more like skimmers than pelicans. They buy the right outfits at LL Bean and Eddie Bauer, carry field guides, they watch the nature programs on television, shop at the Nature Company, which no longer exists, by the way, and pay their dues to the National Wildlife Federation or the National Audubon Society. These activities are admirable, but they do not ensure truly intimate contact with nature. Many such naturalists merely skim, reaping a shallow reward. Yet the great majority of the people associate with nature even less. And this is why it's incumbent upon us at whatever level of appreciation we have for the natural world to get others onto our platform. And how do we do that? Take to all the media. Okay, that includes social media. Now, Facebook and Instagram, they're in the center, they're under the umbrella of Meta, and Meta is coming under increasing fire for its capitulation with the idea that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives should not be honored. Its fact checking has gone down, if not out the window. So if you don't want to partake in platforms like that, that's understandable. Blue Sky is the more positive version of X or Twitter. Indeed, it was founded by a co-founder of Twitter. YouTube and TikTok are video-centered platforms. TikTok being much more user-friendly for the younger generation, I think, but I know a lot of adults who look in on it as well. What else? There's podcasts like Talking Feral. Make yourself a guest on a podcast or start your own podcast. There's always room for more and differing perspectives. Please continue uploading your observations to iNaturalist and Project Noah. That's a great place to do both, to make contributions to the scientific community as well as to recruit more people to the idea of nature recreation. Maybe you have a blog, or maybe you've thought about starting a blog. There's no time like the present to do that. Again, different people have different perspectives from different places in the world, and the lens through which you look at things is always important for other people to see through as well. Another way to foster an appreciation for nature is to participate in events like bio blitzes, or maybe the City Nature Challenge. The poster in the upper left, though, is for the City Nature Challenge in Colorado Springs from a few years back, and it's in Spanish. That's another way you can become more inclusive, is to recognize that not everyone in your community probably has English as their first language. So make things easier on them by providing graphics and other kinds of helpful media in their chosen language. Be a mentor. My first mentor in the bottom left there was Jim Anderson. And this was when I lived back in Oregon, and he helped encourage me to continue my pursuit of entomology. And I'm doing my best to carry that on. Maybe it's one individual interaction at a time, or maybe it's a sustained relationship. Mentorship can take many different forms. Remember that we have the right to peaceably assemble. This is the biggest week in American birding at McGee Marsh in Northwest Ohio near Toledo and Oak Harbor. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. The biggest week this year is May 9th through 18th. It's usually in that vicinity in every May when migration comes through there. And you can get great eye-to-eye views of warblers and other songbirds. It's a very polite crowd, but if crowds are not your thing, that's understandable as well. We also are guaranteed from our Constitution the ability to petition the government for redress of grievances, and maybe that takes the form of protests. Again, that's reacting to events as they come rather than being more proactive, but sometimes that's necessary. Now, in my fantasies, this is what's happening. Now, I don't recommend doing this. Pretty sure that's a felony, holding a developer hostage. But in my again, in my fantasy, I envision chaining developers to trees next to the pond they want to drain, and having them sit there for a week and watching the herons and the beaver and otters and what have you, and seeing that after that week, if they still are so inclined to develop that landscape. And of course, what I'm getting at here is we need to be creative in, maybe not violent, but creative in the ways we get people in places of power to think differently and to recognize that there are other values aside from shareholder profits, for example. Maybe we need to reach those shareholders in some fashion and get them to see things through a different lens. So basically, we need to be the angry birds. We can't rely on the birds themselves, short of a Hitchcock movie, I guess, you know, this is one way where we are speaking for other species in terms of our temperament, maybe. But yeah, we need to be a lot more aggressive in terms of advocating for ourselves on and those other organisms that we hold dear. So, be not just a grumpy old bird, all right, be an angry old bird or two in a creative manner. Okay. You got to fight for your right to bird. And with that, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak, and to David for inviting me, and for my partner Heidi to help me with the technical end of our digital age here, and for the many mentors here that I hold dear. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was a lot of food for thought for sure. Why don't we go ahead and we'll unshare the screen for a minute, and we'll see if we have people that would like to have a question or speak. So let's see. Oh, there it is. All right. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions that that you have? I mean, feel free to speak up. I know from my own experience, I've over the years, we've done several accessible birding events. When our dear friend Joe Saperchi was alive, he was the impetus for doing a lot of that activity, and it really was good because it wasn't Joe happened to be in a wheelchair, but we also had a lot of other people around that really couldn't walk far and couldn't really necessarily go for long distances without a bench. You know what I mean? So it's always good to do that. And we have done some field trips. We've done a couple of them with different groups that really emphasize the accessibility aspects of this. We can go to Turner's Falls and that area, and you can bird pretty much within 15 feet of your car. You know what I mean? So you really can see a lot of stuff, particularly in the winter, and I think we should be concentrating on doing some more of these inclusive activities. you know. We're also working pretty hard now with some of the youth in our area to try to, we have a teacher that's interested in doing this and really, supporting those initiatives, and again, investing in people. Um, and I think that's the future that we have is really the next generations that are coming along. So, um, anybody else who has a comment? I see a couple um, comments in the chat. Nicely said and good thoughts from our friend Tom Tyning and Diane Nazif also. Thank you very much for the great talk and information that you provided. Very inclusive of so many perspectives. And I agree. I mean, we're learning quite a bit now about how to interact with indigenous folks now, the indigenous persons. We can't pretend that we know what they can't just come to tell us this is how we think or whatever. We have to let them express how that is in their relationships and not try to assume that we know. And it's pretty, it's a learning curve for all of us.
Yeah.
Uh, I really, I think as a birding community and a naturalist community, that we're in a position to have the higher road here. You know what I mean? And I think we're up to it. So I appreciate everybody's time, and certainly if anybody has any other comments, I'd be happy to hear them.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that Athol Bird and Nature Club is ahead of the curve on this. I had forgotten actually that you had the accessible birding outings, but that's an excellent point. The other aspect of that, by the way, is sharing those successes with other groups. So if you're on speaking terms with other birding organizations or nature clubs, to share what's worked for you, give them a little bit of a foundation to start their own kinds of activities if they haven't already. So I'm glad you reminded me of that. Thank you for that. And yeah, I'm still learning. I need to plug myself into more networks, especially for the neurodivergent community and the indigenous peoples as well, so that I'm not spouting things of which I know so little.
Yeah, I know. I'm just reading. For those that don't know, I actually took a job and went back to work after 12 years of retirement. Um, and I'm working with the Mount Grace Land Trust, and we're having these. One of the notes was that the need for people housing and preserving natural landscapes is a real dynamic that we're really becoming aware of. So even in places that we want people to live in places that are sustainable, and I know here in my town of Athol, we're really trying to promote the development of the inner town area that has all the amenities of water and sewer and close proximity to whatever stores are left, and and it's a struggle to try to keep that without just every time somebody wants to build some project, they take the first piece of vacant land they find, no matter what lives on it, and chops it all down and paves it over. So we're trying to acknowledge that need and try to figure out constructive ways to meet that need for human habitation, as well as trying to protect as much of the natural world as we can.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. Yeah, I saw that comment in the chat as well, and I think it's a um, um, excellent point. But I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive. And I mean, when I was growing up in Portland, Oregon, the answer there was infill. Using uh, existing developments that were no longer relevant and converting them to things that were relevant, including housing. They also instituted an urban growth boundary, which Now, when I go back to Portland today, I'm wondering where exactly that boundary is again. It still looks like a lot of sprawl to me, and the traffic is worse than Los Angeles now. But the other aspect of the urban growth boundary is that your growth is paid for ahead of time, so you're not having to make what's the and you're not having to annex other jurisdictions in order to pay for new development there. Everything is expected to go there. So your public transit and utilities are all paid for up to that growth boundary. And the growth boundary can be extended at will by legislative initiative, that kind of thing. So I think there are models out there, is what I'm saying, that can help address those kinds of things. Now, getting people on board and adhering to that is another kind of thing altogether. And that goes back again to addressing, why is there more profit to be made developing vacant land than there is in, resurrecting things within the inner city?
Yeah. Yeah, I did, we recently had a talk by Doug Tallamy, and he actually we talk about Oregon and Portland being the most forested city in the country, but they're all non-native trees. So they're actually biological deserts when it comes to the native species that inhabit them. So even if we're having development happening, there's ways that we can develop to make it better for wildlife and better for the whole ecosystem by adhering to some basic thoughts about planting native trees and doing that stuff so our native insects and birds are actually have something to eat. So I think it's just another way of thinking about that. And I know I'm going to be going to a meeting soon about the availability of native plants and stuff for distribution. It's really difficult if you're trying to grow native to find, you know, genotypes that are for our area and in a quantity and at a price that isn't exorbitant. We're trying to do the right thing, and yet you go to a native plant nursery and it's twice the cost as it would have been at your local Walmart. You know what I mean? With all their neonicotinoids attached. So I think there's ways that we can maybe work on that as a community, and a lot of these things like native plants, it's the demand for native plants will drive those industries that produce them into providing them. So if we tell our local retailers and plant places that we really want to produce and have native genotype plants in our community, if they get the word enough, they'll start providing them. Then we have to purchase them too. But I think that's the way to kind of help to move that concept along. So even if we're building houses and stuff, we can actually incorporate some good practices that make them less onerous than just paving everything and putting up a couple of butterfly bushes and think we're okay. So, all right. Well, I think we've hit our hour. I really want to thank Eric for taking his time and joining with us. And we will have this recording available to us. Oh, Jane, you had a question?
No, thank you, Dave. It wasn't a question. It was really more of a comment that
Sure.
in the midst of the presentation, I made a note of the sort of comment that was relevant to, what a diverse group of people can bring to birding. And I would think, well, of course, because if those of us who attend to nature recognize the strength of diversity in the natural world itself. And the thought of going, birding with people with very different perspectives or experiences is really enriching. And sometime this winter, I was on a birding call and someone raised a comment, and I can't remember, I'm sure it was written in a book, I don't know, but they said, it's not so much what you know, but what you notice. And if you're able to actually imagine, because I do this, because I see Jeff Johnstone here, and so he knows I know not, I can never recognize birds. I'm getting better at it though, Jeff, because I've seen a lot with you. But people like, I noticed a lot of things though, and people there who have that knowledge are really very helpful in giving meaning to it. So I really do enjoy being out with a group of people who see things differently. And you know, and I think it's a shift a bit in you know, how we're used to birding and going out and what are you seeing and keeping count. Different birding, I think that different adventures in birding can have different purposes behind them. You know, if you're doing a birding count, yeah, you're counting birds because that's what you're there for. But there's just different ways, and I think what I've seen in some different groups I've been out with is the ability to relax on what you think are all the rules about what it means to go birding. So I think that's the exclusionary part that can keep some people from participating, but to just invite people to come, because the other thing people really get from that is the whole just the physical, mental health of being in nature. And then I also think of when, Bob Putnam wrote his book, Bowling Alone, and he's just been doing some new movie and some talks on that. And he makes the distinction about getting people together. And he talks about connections, and the bonding connections are among people who are similar. And I think that's what, we're used to. But then he talks about bridging connections, which are people who are different and diverse in what they think about and how they think about things. And the real difference that's made when we have bridging connections across our communities. So as I was listening to you tonight, those different thoughts were coming to mind in terms of what it means, yes, for our environment and for the wares, but overall, as we build and rebuild community and I don't know, different. Anyway, I want to thank you. I was very tired tonight, but I'm really glad I came because it was really helpful to listen. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna look up that quote and I remember Bowling Alone, but I'm gonna look up the author now too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
All right. Okay, well, I think that'll do it for this evening. I really, again, thank Eric for taking the time, and for all of you for sharing your thoughts and thinking deep about how we're interacting with our neighbors and some of the people that are a little further away. So have a great night. Stay out of the ice and snow tonight. So
Thank
we'll,
you.
Thank you.
watch our feet in the morning. All right. Good night, everybody.
Stay
Good
safe.
night.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Eric.